There is a book that was removed from the Bible, not lost, not forgotten in the ordinary way, but deliberately set aside by councils of learned men who read it carefully and decided, for reasons that still occupy scholars today, that it was too strange, too sprawling, too insistent about things that other scriptures preferred to leave vague. For more than 1,000 years it survived at the edges of the canon, cherished in some communities, condemned in others, copied by hand in languages most people could not read. And at the centre of that book is a story about a world that existed before the Great Flood, a civilization of such peculiar character that the text cannot quite decide whether it was glorious or catastrophic, whether the beings who built it were divine gifts or divine mistakes. That tension, that refusal to resolve, is what makes the Book of Enoch worth listening to carefully. Because hidden inside its long visionary chapters is something that reads less like mythology and more like a memory of something real, something complicated, something the ancient world felt the need to explain but could not quite bring itself to fully describe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always enjoy picturing where everyone is settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let us ease into tonight's journey together. The world of the Book of Enoch begins not with chaos and not with creation, but with observation. Someone is watching the sky. The figure at the centre of the text is Enoch, a name most people encounter only briefly in the book of Genesis, where he appears in a genealogy that covers generations in a few short verses. Genesis tells us that Enoch lived 365 years, that he walked with God, and that he was not, for God took him. That last phrase is one of the most quietly astonishing sentences in all of ancient literature. Every other figure in that genealogy lived out their days and died. Enoch did not die. He simply was not. The text moves on without explanation, as though the strangeness of what it just said is too large to address directly. That silence is where the Book of Enoch begins. It reaches into that gap and fills it with an extraordinarily detailed account of where Enoch went, what he saw, and what he was shown. He was taken on journeys through the heavens. He saw the storehouses of wind and snow, the chambers where the dead wait, the ends of the earth where the pillars of the sky reach downward. He met angels by name. He was given visions of judgment, of the fate of the wicked and the righteous, of a world that was going to end and begin again. And through all of this, he kept returning to one story, one central catastrophe that he positioned as the reason the flood was necessary, the reason the world before his time had to be washed away and started over. That story is the story of the Watchers, and it is worth taking some time with, because it is not quite like anything else in the ancient world, even though echoes of it appear everywhere once you know what you're looking for. To understand what the Book of Enoch is, it helps to understand what it is not. It is not a single unified text written by one person at one time. The scholars who study it carefully, and there are more of them now than at any point in the last several centuries, generally divide it into several distinct sections that were probably composed at different times, in different hands, and collected together over a period that may span several centuries. The earliest portions are thought to date to somewhere in the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era, which places them in the tumultuous period of the Hellenistic world, when Greek ideas and Jewish traditions were rubbing against each other with considerable cultural friction. Other portions may be older in their basic content, drawing on traditions that circulated orally or in texts we no longer have. The youngest sections may have been composed as late as the 1st century of the Common Era. This composite nature matters for tonight's story. When we talk about what the Book of Enoch says about the world before the flood, we're really talking about a conversation that stretched across centuries, a long argument between different communities of ancient thinkers about questions that would not leave them alone. Why does the world contain so much evil? Where did violence come from? What are angels exactly? And what is their relationship to human beings? What happened to make the flood necessary? And was what came after the flood truly better? The Book of Enoch does not answer these questions the way a catechism might, with tidy doctrinal statements. It answers them the way a dream answers them, with images and figures and journeys and an emotional logic that operates just beneath the surface of the literal narrative. The section that deals most directly with the world before the flood is known to scholars as the Book of the Watchers. It occupies the first 36 chapters of the compiled text, and is widely considered to be among the oldest portions of the whole collection. It begins with a vision of cosmic judgment and then pivots, unexpectedly, into a story that starts in the most concrete possible way. It begins with desire. It begins with eyes looking downward from somewhere high. The Watchers in this text are a specific class of angelic being. Their name in the original Aramaic, the language in which the oldest fragments of the Book of Enoch survive, is a word that means those who watch, those who are awake, those who keep vigil. They are distinguished from other heavenly beings by this quality of wakefulness, of attention, of looking. And what they look at in the story the Book of Enoch tells is the daughters of men. They look down at human women and find them beautiful, and that looking is where the trouble begins. The text is very specific about what happens next. A group of 200 Watchers, led by a figure named Shemihaza, make a decision together. They take an oath, binding themselves collectively to something they all know is transgressive, because they understand that what they are about to do is not permitted. The oath is itself a striking detail. They do not act impulsively. They deliberate. They recognize the weight of what they are choosing. Shemihaza says to them, "I fear that perhaps you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty for a great sin." And they answer him, "Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this deed." The oath is how they distribute the guilt. No one bears it alone. All of them together descend. That descent happens at a place the text names as Ades, identified with the summit of a mountain, possibly connected to the range of Hermon in the region we now call Lebanon and northern Israel. The specific mountain of Hermon carries an interesting resonance, because the name Hermon is related to a word meaning devotion, or anathema, a thing set apart, a thing forbidden. Whether or not the original authors intended that etymology, it is the kind of detail that the text's careful readers have noticed for a very long time. The Watchers come down, they take wives from among the human women. And then the text does something that is unusual in ancient religious literature. Instead of moving immediately to punishment and consequences, it pauses to describe what the Watchers taught. This is where the civilization before the flood enters the story. Because what the Book of Enoch describes is not simply a transgression of a cosmic boundary between the divine and the human, it describes a transfer of knowledge, a massive world-altering transfer of knowledge from a realm beyond human access to the human world. And the text cannot make up its mind about whether this knowledge was a gift or a curse. The Watchers taught humanity a great many things. The text lists them with a specificity that feels almost like a curriculum, a record of what the antediluvian world knew that it had not known before. One Watcher named Azazel taught men to make swords and shields and breastplates, taught them the working of metals, showed them how iron could be shaped and how bronze could be smelted. He taught women the art of ornamentation, the use of cosmetics, the dyeing of cloth, the wearing of jewellery made from precious things pulled from the earth. Another Watcher named Shemihaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Others taught astrology, the reading of the stars and the moon, and the patterns of the sky. Others taught the interpretation of omens, the properties of plants, the movement of clouds, the signs of the earth. Taken together, this curriculum reads like a list of the foundational technologies and knowledge systems of early civilization: metallurgy, astronomy, agriculture in its more sophisticated forms, medicine and herbalism, the arts of war, the arts of beauty and self-presentation, the whole catalogue of what separates a complex society from a simple one. The implication sitting quietly beneath the surface of the text is that human beings did not develop these things on their own. They were given to them, and the giving was transgressive. This is an idea with a very long history in the ancient world, and it is worth pausing over that history because it illuminates something important about what the Book of Enoch is doing. The Greeks told a story about Prometheus, a divine figure who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. He was punished for this in ways that the Greeks described with considerable relish, chained to a rock, his liver eaten daily by an eagle, and regenerated each night to be eaten again. The gift of fire in the Greek version is simultaneously the gift of all technology and civilization, since fire is the precondition of metalworking, pottery, cooking, warmth. Prometheus gives humanity the ability to survive and to build, and he is punished not because the gift was bad for humanity, but because the gods had reasons for keeping it from them. The Watcher's story operates on a similar emotional logic, but with significant differences. In the Greek telling, the divine figure who gives the gift is sympathetic. Prometheus is a rebel who loves humanity enough to suffer for them. In the Book of Enoch, the Watcher's motivation is not love of humanity in any general sense. It is desire, it is want. The knowledge transfers as a consequence of transgression, not as an act of benevolence. The Watchers teach these things not to help humanity flourish, but because they have come down into the human world for their own reasons, and their teaching is part of how they establish themselves in that world. The gift is real, but it is tangled up with something darker from the very beginning. There is another Mesopotamian tradition that runs parallel to all of this, and it is one that modern scholars of the ancient Near East find particularly interesting when placed next to the Book of Enoch. The Babylonian tradition speaks of beings called the Apkallu, a word often translated as sages or wise ones. The Apkallu in Babylonian cosmology were 7 beings of extraordinary wisdom who appeared before the Great Flood, sent by the god of wisdom and waters to live among human beings and teach them the arts of civilization. They taught architecture, writing, medicine, ritual, mathematics. They are credited with the establishment of cities, with the creation of the social and intellectual foundations that make organized life possible. In Babylonian art, they are often depicted as figures with the bodies of fish or with wings, marking them as beings who crossed between realms, who moved between the waters and the land, between the divine and the human. After the flood, the tradition holds, other Apkallu appeared, but they were diminished, partly human, no longer purely divine. Something had been lost in the cataclysm. The parallels between the Apkallu tradition and the Watcher's story are close enough that scholars debate whether they are drawing on a shared source, whether one influenced the other, or whether both are independent attempts to answer the same ancient question. The question is this: why does civilization exist? Where did the knowledge that makes human life complex and organized, and capable of great beauty and great violence come from? The answer in both traditions is the same. It came from somewhere outside the purely human. It was brought, it was given, it arrived from beyond. Tonight we're going to sit with that question for a long time, following it through the Book of Enoch's long, strange narrative and out into the broader world where similar stories echoed and amplified across many cultures and many centuries. We're going to look at what the text says about the world the Watchers helped create and at what happened to that world. We're going to spend time with the children of the Watchers, the Nephilim, who are among the most discussed and disputed figures in all of ancient literature, and we're going to follow the tradition forward into the communities that preserved it, copied it, argued over it, and eventually decided what to do with it. But first, the night outside your window deserves a moment. Whatever is out there, the trees or the buildings or the open sky, the world is quieter now than it was a few hours ago. The fan, if you have one running, is doing its steady work. You can let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you're lying. The story will still be here. The world that the Book of Enoch describes before the flood is not a world of simplicity or innocence. It is a world that the Watchers and their descendants made complicated. Once the descent happened, once the teaching began, the text describes a rapid acceleration of violence and corruption that has the character of a chain reaction. The Watchers consort with human women. The unions produce children, and those children are the Nephilim. The word Nephilim appears in the Hebrew Bible, most famously in Genesis, where it is mentioned almost in passing in a context that the authors seem deliberately to leave unclear. The relevant verse simply states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That is essentially all that Genesis says. The Book of Enoch says considerably more. In the Book of Enoch's telling, the Nephilim are giants, enormous, physically overwhelming beings whose appetites outstrip everything the world can provide. The text gives measurements that are difficult to take literally, but that create a vivid image of beings who are simply too large for the world they inhabit. They consume everything. When the food of human beings is insufficient, they turn to animals, eating in quantities that devastate the herds and flocks. When animals are insufficient, they turn on human beings themselves, and when human flesh is not enough, they turn on one another. The progression has a nightmarish internal logic. These are beings whose scale of need cannot be met by any ordinary provision, and the world suffers accordingly. This is one reading. But there is another way to understand what the text is describing that moves alongside the literal imagery without dismissing it. The Nephilim as figures of excess, of appetite without restraint, of power without wisdom, may be less a description of physical giants than a description of a kind of civilization, a way of organizing human life that is defined by the limitless consumption of resources, by violence as a tool of acquisition, by the application of advanced knowledge in the service of domination rather than flourishing. The technologies the Watchers taught, metalworking and astronomy and the arts of war, are not inherently destructive, but in the hands of the Nephilim, the text suggests, they become instruments of catastrophe. The knowledge that could have built something is turned instead toward taking. This reading, which is sometimes called an allegorical or symbolic interpretation of the Nephilim, is not simply a modern imposition on the text. Ancient readers made similar moves. The tradition of interpreting the Nephilim as representatives of a corrupt social order, rather than as literal physical giants, runs through several centuries of Jewish and early Christian commentary. The two readings coexisted, sometimes in the same author, because the text was rich enough to support both. What the two readings share is the central diagnosis. Something went wrong before the flood. The mechanism of that going wrong involved the mixture of what should have remained separate, the divine and the human, the transcendent and the earthly, and the consequences of that mixture were not the glorious hybrid civilization it might have been. They were destruction, violence, imbalance, a world that could no longer sustain itself. The Book of Enoch offers a remarkably precise account of the moment when the cry of the earth's suffering reaches heaven. The angels of the highest order, the archangels, look down and see the blood and the violence. They hear the souls of the dead crying from the earth, and they bring the news to the highest divine authority, describing what has happened in language that is both vivid and strangely formal, the language of a report, a legal brief, a witness statement. The earth has become empty of inhabitants. The blood that has been shed cries out to the gates of heaven. The souls of men are making their suit, and their groaning has ascended. This moment in the text, this formal presentation of evidence before a cosmic court, tells us something important about the intellectual and cultural world in which the Book of Enoch was composed. The imagery is deeply shaped by the legal and bureaucratic structures of the Hellenistic and late Second Temple period. Heaven, in this vision, operates according to principles of procedure. Evidence is gathered, presented, evaluated. A judgment is issued. The response to evil is not simply divine wrath, but something more like divine justice, a process with steps, with witnesses, with a weighing of what has been done. This gives the pre-flood world a kind of juridical weight. It is not simply destroyed, it is adjudicated. The judgment that comes down from that cosmic process is the flood, but it is preceded by something else. The archangels, Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Uriel, are given specific assignments. They are to bind the Watchers. They are to imprison the Nephilim spirits. They are to preserve a single human lineage, the family of Noah, through which the world will begin again. And they are to heal the earth of all that has been done to it, to remove the traces of the corruption so that a new beginning is genuinely possible. But here the text does something quietly remarkable. The spirits of the Nephilim, the text says, will not be destroyed. They will not be bound in the way the Watchers are bound. Instead, they are left loose in the world. They become evil spirits. They afflict human beings. They cause illness and violence and confusion. They have no bodies, and so they seek to inhabit the world of the bodily, to disturb it, to unsettle it, and they will do this until the final judgment. This detail is one of the most consequential things the Book of Enoch says about the world after the flood, which is to say our world. It means that the pre-flood catastrophe did not fully end with the waters. Something of that antediluvian civilization, something of its corruption and its hunger, survived in a form that the flood could not touch. The waters cleansed the earth of the Nephilim's bodies, of the physical wreckage of their appetites, but the spirits persisted. And those spirits are, in the text cosmology, the origin of what we might today call demonic influence, of the invisible forces that push human beings toward violence, excess, and self-destruction. This is the hidden architecture that the Book of Enoch places beneath the world we live in. The civilization before the flood left a legacy, not a legacy of monuments or texts or material remains, but a legacy of spirits, of unhoused presences that are perpetually trying to re-enter the world from which the flood expelled them. And the result is that history, human history after the flood, is not simply a fresh beginning. It is a continuation of a much older struggle. That idea that the pre-flood world was not simply erased but, in some sense, persists, is one of the most quietly radical things the text contains, and it is an idea that will echo through everything we explore in the sessions ahead. For now, though, let the thoughts settle. You do not need to hold all of this at once. The story has a long way yet to travel, and there is no need to arrive quickly anywhere. The night is full of its own comfortable wait. Wherever you are, whatever soft darkness surrounds the place where you are resting, there is time. The lamp is low, the fan is turning. The world before the flood waits patiently just ahead. The social world in which the Book of Enoch circulated is itself a fascinating subject, and one that helps explain why the text says what it says in the way that it says it. The Jewish communities of the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era were communities under considerable pressure. The conquests of Alexander the Great had swept through the ancient Near East and brought in their wake a tidal wave of Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek aesthetic values, Greek religion in its syncretistic forms. For Jewish communities committed to maintaining the distinctiveness of their traditions, this was not an abstract challenge, it was a daily reality. Greek names, Greek customs, Greek education, Greek forms of governance and economic organisation were everywhere. The question of how much accommodation was appropriate, of where the boundaries of Jewish identity lay, was not a theoretical debate. It was a matter of communal survival. The Book of Enoch, in its description of the Watchers and the antediluvian civilization they helped create, can be read as a meditation on exactly this question. The Watchers cross a boundary they are not supposed to cross. They enter a world that is not their own. They bring knowledge and power that transforms that world, and the transformation, for all its apparent gifts, leads to catastrophe. The story is, in this reading, a story about what happens when boundaries are dissolved, when the separate things of the world are mixed together without wisdom, when power is transferred without understanding the full weight of what the transfer means. This is not to reduce the Book of Enoch to a simple allegory for Hellenistic cultural pressure. The text is too complex and too earnest for that, and its authors seem to have believed the story they were telling in ways that go beyond mere political allegory. But the context does help explain the intensity with which the text insists on the consequences of the Watcher's transgression. The stakes, for the communities that first wrote and read these words, were not merely mythological, they were existential. There is also a priestly dimension to this that scholars have explored at length. The Book of Enoch draws on and engages with priestly traditions about the proper ordering of sacred space and sacred time, about what belongs in what category, and what happens when categories are violated. The Watchers transgress the boundary between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. The Nephilim transgress the boundaries between the adequate and the excessive, between the use of knowledge and the abuse of it. And the flood is the cosmic act of restoration, of re-establishing the proper separations that make an ordered world possible. The priestly mind, in ancient Jewish thought, is a mind deeply concerned with order, with the maintenance of distinctions, with the catastrophic consequences of mixing what should be kept apart. The Book of Enoch is, among other things, a profoundly priestly text. All of this means that when we ask what the Book of Enoch hid about the civilization before the flood, we're asking a question with many layers. At the most literal layer, the text describes a specific antediluvian world with specific inhabitants, specific technologies, specific catastrophes. At a deeper layer, it describes a theory of evil, of where corruption comes from and why it is so persistent. At a deeper layer still, it is a document of its own time, shaped by the anxieties and commitments of communities trying to make sense of a world that was changing faster than they could fully process. None of these layers cancels the others. That is the nature of great ancient literature. It speaks to its own time and to times it could not have imagined, and it speaks differently to each. Tonight we are following all three layers as they braid through the long, strange story that the Book of Enoch tells. We have, in this first part of our journey, established the world. We have met Enoch and understood why he matters, and why that single enigmatic phrase in Genesis, "He was not, for God took him," carries so much weight. We have encountered the Watchers and their descent, understood the curriculum of knowledge they brought with them, and begun to grasp the Nephilim and what their existence meant for the antediluvian world. We have situated the text in its historical and cultural context without reducing it to that context, and we have touched the idea that will carry us through the rest of this journey, that the pre-flood civilization is not simply a past thing, but a persistent presence, a set of questions that keep returning in different forms across the long centuries of human history. The specific mountain where the Watchers came down still exists, still rises above the landscape of the ancient Near East. The texts that preserve Enoch's journeys were copied and recopied in monasteries and scriptoria across many centuries. The questions the Book of Enoch asks have never gone away. They have only taken new forms. The room where you are resting is very quiet now. The story is settling around you like the soft weight of a blanket. There is no need to hold every detail. They will be here when you return, or they will simply do their work in the background, the way long stories always do. The lamp, if it is still lit, can stay where it is. The fan keeps its steady sound. The night holds you gently. The next part of the story waits just ahead, unhurried, ready when you are. The fan turns softly. The night is deep. The story continues just ahead. The story of the Watchers does not begin and end with desire. That is the surface of it, the part that catches the eye first, the part that has made the Book of Enoch controversial in certain circles for a very long time. But beneath the story of transgression and descent, beneath the catalogue of forbidden knowledge and the catalogue of catastrophic children, there is a more patient question working its way through the text. It is a question about the nature of the world before the flood, about what kind of place it actually was, what kind of knowledge it contained, and what was lost when the waters came. The Book of Enoch does not answer this question directly. It answers it sideways, through imagery and detail and the weight of what it chooses to describe at length versus what it chooses to compress into a single sentence. And when you learn to read it that way, when you learn to follow what the text lingers over versus what it moves quickly past, the antediluvian world begins to take on a strange and specific shape. One of the things the text lingers over is astronomy. The astronomical sections of the Book of Enoch are among its most distinctive and, for modern readers, most surprising features. There is an entire section of the compiled text known as the Astronomical Book, which scholars sometimes call the Book of the Luminaries, and it is devoted in extraordinary detail to the movements of the sun and the moon, to the gates through which they pass, to the lengths of days and nights across the cycle of the year, to the relationship between the solar calendar and the lunar calendar, to the angels who are responsible for guiding the celestial bodies along their proper courses. This section is technical in a way that stands out even within the visionary framework of the broader text. It reads, in places, like a manual, like something that was meant to be used. The calendar system that the astronomical book describes and defends is a solar calendar of 364 days, divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, with each month containing 30 days and 4 additional days distributed across the year at the transitions between seasons. This is not the calendar that most Jewish communities in the Second Temple period were using. The calendar in common use was a lunar calendar, or more precisely a lunar-solar calendar that attempted to reconcile the moon's cycles with the solar year. The solar calendar of the Book of Enoch's astronomical book was the calendar of a specific community, possibly the community associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, certainly a community that felt the calendar question was not a minor administrative matter, but a profound theological one. Why does this matter for our story about the civilization before the flood? Because the astronomical book presents this calendar not as a human invention, or even as a priestly tradition, but as revealed knowledge. It is the knowledge that Enoch received during his heavenly journeys, transmitted to him by the angel Uriel. It is, in other words, the proper ordering of time itself, the correct way to count and measure and honor the movement of the cosmos, and the implication that runs through the text is that this knowledge, this correct relationship between human beings and the structure of time, existed before the flood and was in danger of being lost after it. Enoch's role, in part, is to preserve it, to write it down so that it survives the catastrophe and can be transmitted to the righteous who come after. This gives the antediluvian world a specific intellectual character in the Book of Enoch's telling. It was a world that knew how time worked, a world that had access to the proper structure of the cosmos, that could read the sky with precision, that understood the relationship between celestial movements and terrestrial life. The Watchers brought some of this knowledge down with them, though in the text the astronomical teachings of the Watchers are ambiguous, partly legitimate and partly dangerous in their application. But the idea that the world before the flood possessed a sophisticated cosmological understanding is present throughout the text in various forms. This connects the Book of Enoch to a much wider tradition in the ancient world, a tradition that deserves careful attention. Across many ancient cultures, there exists a persistent belief that the most important and fundamental knowledge, the knowledge of how the cosmos is structured and how human life can align itself with that structure, was originally given by beings or figures who came from beyond the purely human realm. We have already touched on the Babylonian Apkallu, but the pattern recurs in many other places. In the ancient Egyptian tradition, the god Thoth is credited with the invention of writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the ordering of time. He is the divine scribe who maintains the records of the cosmos, who knows the hidden names of things, who stands at the intersection of the divine and the human as a transmitter of sacred knowledge. The tradition of Hermetic philosophy, which will become enormously important in the later history of the Book of Enoch's influence, identified Thoth with the Greek Hermes and with a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, who was supposed to be the human or semi-divine ancestor of all esoteric wisdom. The texts attributed to this figure, the Hermetic corpus, describe a primordial revelation of cosmic knowledge to a sage who then transmitted it to humanity. The structure is identical to what the Book of Enoch describes. A figure who stands between worlds receives knowledge from beyond the human and transmits it downward. In the Sumerian tradition, the figure of the antediluvian king Ziusudra, who corresponds to the biblical Noah in the Mesopotamian flood narratives, is preceded by a list of kings whose reigns lasted for tens of thousands of years each. These antediluvian kings, according to the tradition, ruled during an era when the conditions of life were fundamentally different from what came after. The knowledge available to them, the relationship between heaven and earth, the directness of divine communication, all of this was of a different order from what post-flood humanity could access. The flood marks the beginning of a diminishment, a move from an era of unmediated divine presence to an era of memory and text and transmitted tradition. The Book of Enoch sits within this broader pattern and adds its own distinctive contribution to it. What makes the Enochic tradition unusual is the moral complexity of its account of the antediluvian world. Other traditions tend to idealize the pre-flood era, presenting it as a golden age whose loss is mourned. The Enochic tradition refuses that simple idealization. The pre-flood world was a world of knowledge and of catastrophe. It was a world where extraordinary understanding existed alongside extraordinary violence. The Watchers brought wisdom, and they brought ruin simultaneously, not because wisdom and ruin are the same thing, but because the manner in which the knowledge was transferred, in transgression, in the mixing of what should have remained separate, poisoned the gift at its source. This moral ambivalence about the antediluvian world is one of the most sophisticated aspects of the Book of Enoch's cosmology. It refuses the easy answer. It will not let you simply mourn the lost golden age or simply celebrate the flood as a purification. It insists on holding both truths at once, that something real and valuable existed before the flood, and that it was corrupted in ways that made the flood necessary. Let the fan keep its quiet rhythm for a moment. You're more than halfway through this part of the story, and the ideas we've been moving through deserve a little space to settle. The antediluvian world in the Book of Enoch's telling is not a simple place. It is a place of real knowledge and real damage, of gifts that came entangled with transgression. That complexity is what makes it worth thinking about carefully. The figure of Azazel, who appears in the Book of Enoch as one of the chief watchers and the teacher of metallurgy and ornamentation, deserves particular attention. Azazel is not simply an incidental character in the text. He's positioned as the one who bears the greatest responsibility for the corruption of the world before the flood. The Archangel Raphael is specifically assigned to bind Azazel, to cast him into a darkness under the desert where he will remain until the final judgment. And the text explicitly states that the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel, and the whole sin should be ascribed to him. That is a remarkable statement. Of all the things the Watchers did, it is the teaching of metallurgy and the arts of war, combined with the teaching of cosmetic ornamentation, that is identified as the root of the world's corruption. The text connects these two things in a way that is worth unpacking slowly. The weapons made from worked metal enable violence on a scale that was previously impossible. The arts of personal adornment enable a particular kind of seduction and self-presentation that the text views as deceitful, as a falsification of the self. Together, they represent the two primary instruments of domination: violence and manipulation, the physical force that compels by fear and the social force that compels by desire. Azazel's teaching put both of these into the world simultaneously, and the combination proved catastrophic. The ancient reader hearing this would have recognized the categories immediately. The combination of military power and sexual manipulation as instruments of domination was not an abstract concern. It was a lived political reality for communities under imperial rule, whether Hellenistic or later Roman, who experienced their domination simultaneously through military force and through the cultural prestige that made submission seem attractive, even desirable. The Book of Enoch's diagnosis of the pre-flood world was also, for its original audience, a diagnosis of their own world. Scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which include the oldest surviving manuscript fragments of the Book of Enoch, have noted that the Azazel tradition connects to another ancient Jewish practice that appears in the Torah itself, in the Book of Leviticus. The Day of Atonement ritual, the great annual ceremony of purification and reconciliation, involves 2 goats. One is sacrificed to God, the other is the scapegoat, sent into the wilderness bearing the sins of the community, and the wilderness to which the scapegoat is sent is associated, in the text of Leviticus, with the name Azazel. The word or name appears directly in the Hebrew, and it has been disputed for centuries whether it refers to a place, to a concept, or to a being. The Book of Enoch strongly suggests the third option. Azazel is a being, a bound and punished being whose location in the desert becomes the symbolic destination for the sins of the people. The scapegoat in this reading carries the community's sins back to their ultimate source, returning them to the one responsible for teaching the human world how to sin so effectively. This connection between the Book of Enoch and the Torah's ritual calendar is one of the reasons modern scholars take the Enochic tradition so seriously as a window into early Jewish religious thought. The Book of Enoch is not a peripheral curiosity. It is a text that was in active conversation with the most central religious practices of its community. Its cosmology was not simply speculative theology. It was connected to the liturgical life, to the calendar, to the understanding of what the great communal rituals meant and accomplished. The relationship between the Book of Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the group of Jews who lived in the desert at Qumran, and who left behind the extraordinary library discovered in 1947 and the following years, is one of the richest subjects in all of modern biblical scholarship. The community at Qumran possessed multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, more copies than they possessed of some biblical books. This tells us something about how important the text was to them. It was not simply in their library as a curiosity or a reference, it was central to their worldview. The Qumran community was a community defined by a sense of living at the end of history, at the edge of a great cosmic conflict between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Their most famous text, the one scholars call the War Scroll, describes in elaborate military detail a final apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The Book of Enoch's cosmology, with its watchers and their imprisoned spirits ranging through the world causing affliction, fits naturally into this framework. The evil spirits of the Nephilim, left loose in the world after the flood, become the cosmic enemy, the forces of darkness that the righteous community is called to oppose, and that the final judgment will ultimately destroy. For the Qumran community then, the civilization before the flood was not ancient history in the sense of being finished and irrelevant. It was the origin of the very forces they felt themselves embattled by in their own time. The pre-flood world had produced something that the flood could not eliminate, and that something was still active, still present, still working against the order that God intended. Understanding the antediluvian catastrophe was, for them, essential to understanding their own situation. This has an implication that quietly unsettles the common assumption about how ancient religious texts relate to history. We tend to think of sacred texts as being about the remote past, about founding events and primordial conditions that explain why the world is the way it is. The Book of Enoch certainly has that dimension, but for the communities that read it most intensely, it was also about the present. The past it described was a living past, a past whose consequences were unfolding in the daily experience of the people reading the text. The Watchers had descended, the Nephilim had been destroyed, but their spirits persisted. The world that resulted from all of this was the world those communities were living in. The text was not an explanation of how things used to be, it was a map of how things still were. There is a quiet but persistent scholarly debate about what sources the Book of Enoch drew upon in constructing its account of the antediluvian world, and it is worth spending some time with this question, because it opens out onto a very wide landscape of connected traditions. The most direct biblical source is Genesis, specifically the brief and elusive passage about the sons of God and the daughters of men and the Nephilim. But this passage in Genesis is itself almost certainly drawing on something older, something that the Genesis authors knew and compressed into a few verses, just as they compressed Enoch himself into a few enigmatic words. What was that older source? Several possibilities have been proposed. One school of thought emphasizes the connections to Mesopotamian mythology, particularly to the traditions surrounding the Apkallu sages and the antediluvian kings. The Babylonian myth known to scholars as Atrahasis, which tells the story of a great flood sent by the gods to reduce the noise of an overpopulated humanity, shares structural features with the biblical and Enochic flood narratives while differing in significant ways. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which also contains a flood narrative, depicts Gilgamesh as a figure who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a ratio that makes him neither fully of the divine realm nor fully of the human one, a hybrid whose nature is itself a kind of transgression. The parallel to the Nephilim, children of divine watchers and human women, is suggestive even if it is not exact. Another school of thought looks to Canaanite traditions, which were the immediate cultural context of early Israelite religion, and which contained their own complex mythology of divine beings interacting with the human world. The texts discovered at Ugarit in northern Syria in the 20th century revealed a rich Canaanite mythological tradition that shares vocabulary and imagery with parts of the Hebrew Bible, including imagery of divine councils, of rebellious heavenly beings, and of cosmic conflicts that play out in the human realm. Some scholars have argued that the sons of God in Genesis and the Watchers in the Book of Enoch both descend from Canaanite traditions about lower-tier divine beings, members of the heavenly assembly who have their own agency and their own potential for transgression. A third school of thought, more speculative but not without its advocates, suggests that some of the specific knowledge claims made in the Book of Enoch, particularly the astronomical material, reflect genuinely ancient traditions that may go back considerably further than the text itself. The argument is not that the text is literally describing historical events from before the flood, but rather that the astronomical knowledge embedded in the astronomical book preserves elements of a real intellectual tradition whose origins are very old, older than the Hellenistic period in which the text was compiled, possibly older than the Second Temple period altogether. This last argument is difficult to prove definitively, and mainstream scholarship is appropriately cautious about it. But it is not simply the province of enthusiasts and alternative historians. The question of how old the astronomical traditions embedded in ancient religious texts actually are is a serious scholarly question that archaeoastronomers and historians of science take seriously, and the answer, for many of these traditions, turns out to be older than expected. The night that surrounds you right now is the same sky that the ancient astronomers watched. The stars move in patterns that have not changed in any essential way across the thousands of years we have been talking about. When the Book of Enoch describes the gates through which the sun and moon pass, the positions from which they rise and set at different times of year, it is describing something that a careful observer in the ancient Near East could verify by watching for a season or two. The knowledge was real. What the text argues about is not whether the celestial mechanics work the way they work, but whose knowledge it is, where it came from, and what it means for how human beings should order their lives. That is not a small argument. The calendar question, which is really the astronomical question, is ultimately a question about authority. Who has the right to determine how time is counted? Who possesses the legitimate tradition of cosmological knowledge? The Book of Enoch answers these questions by going all the way back to the beginning, to the primordial transmission of knowledge from the angel Uriel to Enoch himself, before the flood, before the corruptions and compromises that followed. The authority it claims is as ancient as any authority can be. We are beginning to see the full scope of what the Book of Enoch is doing in its account of the civilization before the flood. It is not simply telling a story about angels who behaved badly and giants who ate too much. It is constructing a complete alternative history of human knowledge, a history in which the most important things human beings know about the stars, about metals, about healing, about the proper ordering of time did not arise from within the human realm but were transmitted from outside it. And that transmission was complex and morally compromised from the very beginning, entangled with transgression and desire and the catastrophic mixing of what should have remained separate. The question that this raises, and that the text raises without fully answering, is what to do with that knowledge now. If the most important things the human world knows came originally from a transgressive transmission, if they arrived poisoned at the source, does that make them illegitimate? Can they be purified? Can the knowledge that Azazel brought, the metallurgy and the astronomical lore and the medicinal arts, be separated from the manner in which it arrived and used properly? Or is the corruption irreversible, baked into the knowledge itself, inseparable from its origins? The Book of Enoch does not answer this question directly, but Enoch's own role in the text suggests something. Enoch himself is a figure who crosses the boundary between heaven and earth safely and legitimately. He is taken up, shown the cosmos, given knowledge, and returned. His transmission of that knowledge is not transgressive in the way the Watcher's teaching was transgressive, because it passes through the proper channels, because it is given to him rather than seized by him, because it serves the preservation of the righteous rather than the satisfaction of desire. The implication seems to be that the same knowledge can be transmitted well or badly, can arrive as a gift properly given or as contraband, and that the difference matters enormously. This is a distinction with considerable staying power. The question of whether knowledge is inherently neutral or inherently value-laden, whether the manner of its transmission shapes the knowledge itself, is not a question that ancient religious texts have a monopoly on. It runs through the history of science, through debates about how research is conducted and who benefits from its results, through arguments about the ethics of technology and what it means to be responsible in the application of understanding to the world. The Book of Enoch's framing of this question is ancient and mythological, but the question itself is one that has never lost its relevance. The stars outside, if you can picture them through whatever walls and weather and light pollution separate you from the open sky, are the same stars that Enoch was shown in his heavenly journeys. The constellations have shifted somewhat over the millennia, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis moving the celestial pole in a long circle, so that the North Star of the ancient world was not the North Star we navigate by today. But the patterns are recognizable. Orion still stands in his familiar posture. The Pleiades still cluster together in a small, bright handful. The Milky Way still arches across the deep dark of a truly dark night. All the knowledge the ancients extracted from that sky, all the meaning they found there, was drawn from the same source we would draw from now. And somewhere in the long transmission of that knowledge, the Book of Enoch insists something crucial was either lost or transformed, and the question of what it was is still worth asking. The room where you are listening is settled now. The hour is deep enough that the sounds of the world have simplified, become fewer and steadier. Whatever light remains is warm and low. The story is working its way through layers of time and meaning, and you can follow it as closely or as loosely as feels right. The next part of this journey will take us deeper into the specific figures and traditions that connect the Book of Enoch to the wider ancient world, and to the long, strange history of how the text was preserved, hidden, forgotten, and found again. The fan turns softly. The night is deep. The story continues just ahead. There is a moment in the Book of Enoch that does not receive as much attention as the Descent of the Watchers or the catalogue of forbidden knowledge, but that may be the most revealing passage in the entire text. It is the moment when Enoch is asked to do something that no other figure in ancient religious literature is asked to do in quite the same way. The Watchers, having descended and transgressed and produced the catastrophe that is now drawing the attention of heaven, send a message. They send it to Enoch. They ask him to intercede on their behalf, to carry their petition to the divine court and argue their case, to ask for forgiveness on behalf of beings whose transgression has set the world on the path to destruction. Enoch, the human being who was taken up to walk with God, is being asked to serve as an advocate for fallen angels. He writes out their petition. He sits beside the waters of Dan, in the region north of the land of Israel, near the springs that feed the Jordan River, and he reads the petition aloud until he falls asleep. And in his sleep, the divine response comes back to him, not the forgiveness the Watchers sought, but a judgment, a long and specific and entirely unambiguous judgment that their petition is denied and their punishment is sealed. The beauty of this moment, its quiet narrative perfection, lies in the reversal it enacts. The beings who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, who came down into the human world, now need a human being to carry their words back up. The direction of transmission has been reversed. The Watchers who taught humanity now need a human to speak for them, and the human who speaks for them, who tries and fails to save them, is the same human who will survive by being taken up, while they remain bound in darkness. The layers of that reversal have occupied commentators and scholars for a very long time. It says something about the nature of the boundary the Watchers crossed, that crossing it cost them access to the very realm they came from. It says something about what Enoch represents, that he alone of all human beings can move between realms without losing access to either. And it says something about the antediluvian world itself, that its defining tragedy is not simply the violence and corruption it produced, but the severing of the connection between the human and the divine that the Watchers' transgression caused. They came down to be with human beings and in doing so lost heaven. The result was a world that was neither properly human nor properly divine, but some unstable compound of both, and that compound could not hold. This severance is one of the deep structures of the Enochic tradition, and it shapes everything that follows in the text's long engagement with what the world before the flood was and what was lost when it ended. To understand that loss fully, we need to spend some time with the geographical and cosmological imagination of the Book of Enoch, because the text does not simply describe the antediluvian world in terms of its inhabitants and their actions. It describes it in terms of its physical structure, its relationship to the cosmos, its connection to the regions and forces that lie at the edges of the knowable world. Enoch's journeys, which occupy substantial sections of the text, take him to places that are not simply metaphorical. They have specific locations in the Book of Enoch's cosmography. He travels to the ends of the earth. He sees the place where the winds are stored, vast chambers cut into the mountains at the edge of the world, where the winds of the north and the south and the east and the west are kept and released according to divine command. He sees the treasury of the stars, the place where they wait when they are not travelling across the sky, and he sees stars that have been imprisoned there for disobedience, for not appearing in their appointed times. He sees the river of fire that flows through the regions beyond the ordinary world. He sees the mountain of God, and he sees the tree of life, which the text describes with extraordinary sensory richness, its fragrance like no fragrance that exists in the ordinary world, its fruit something that the righteous will eat at the end of days. He also sees the place of the dead. The text describes a great mountain in the west, hollow inside, containing 4 separate chambers where the spirits of the dead are held until the judgment. The righteous and the wicked are separated even here, even in death, stored in different chambers with different qualities of light and air. And in one of the chambers, the text notes specifically, are the spirits of those who were killed violently, the murdered who cry out and whose petitions reach heaven. This detail connects directly to the cry of the earth that precipitates the divine response to the Watcher's transgression. The dead of the antediluvian world, the victims of the Nephilim's violence, are here, in this mountain, waiting. The cosmological map that emerges from Enoch's journeys is consistent and detailed enough that scholars have spent considerable effort trying to understand what traditions and what actual geographical knowledge lie behind it. The regions Enoch visits include areas that correspond, in a general way, to real places in the ancient Near East and beyond, the mountains of the north, the desert regions of the south, the sea to the west. The text is not simple fantasy geography. It is a visionary elaboration of a real world, pushed to its edges, extended into the regions where ordinary human knowledge gives out and something else begins. This extension of the known world into the visionary is characteristic of the genre scholars call apocalyptic literature, of which the Book of Enoch is one of the earliest and most important examples. Apocalyptic literature, and the word apocalypse simply means revelation or unveiling, is literature that claims to show what is normally hidden. It reveals the structure of heaven, the identity of the forces that control history, the sequence of events that will bring the current age to its end, the shape of what will come after. It is a genre born in conditions of suffering and uncertainty, in communities that feel the ordinary mechanisms of history to be insufficient, that feel the world's injustice to be too deep and too persistent to be addressed by ordinary human action. Apocalyptic literature reaches behind the visible world for an explanation and a hope. The Book of Enoch is the founding text of the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, and through that tradition, it is one of the most important ancestors of everything that comes after it. The Book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Revelation in the New Testament, and a vast literature of apocalyptic texts, both canonical and non-canonical, that shaped the imaginations of Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic communities across many centuries. Understanding what the Book of Enoch says about the world before the flood is, therefore not simply an exercise in recovering an obscure ancient text. It is understanding one of the headwaters of a very long and consequential stream. Let the room be quiet for a moment. Whatever sounds exist beyond the walls of where you are, they're far enough away to be background now. The story is moving through deep territory, and there is no need to follow every detail with the same attention. Some of it will come through as image, as impression, as the texture of a very old way of thinking about the world. That is enough. The figure of Methuselah appears in the Book of Enoch in a way that the brief reference in Genesis does not prepare you for. In the Genesis genealogy, Methuselah is simply the oldest person who ever lived, 969 years, a number so extreme that it has become a cultural shorthand for extraordinary longevity. The Book of Enoch gives him a specific role in the transmission of Enoch's revelations. Enoch addresses portions of his written account directly to Methuselah, instructs him in what he has seen and been shown, entrusts him with the task of carrying the knowledge forward to the generations that will survive the flood. Methuselah is, in this telling, the first keeper of the Enochic tradition, the first in a chain of transmission that stretches from the antediluvian world through the catastrophe of the flood and into the world that comes after. This role for Methuselah is significant because it raises a question the text itself seems aware of. If the civilization before the flood was so thoroughly corrupted, if the Watcher's transgression had so thoroughly poisoned the world that a global flood was necessary to cleanse it, what exactly is being preserved? What is the value of the antediluvian knowledge that Enoch transmits through Methuselah to Noah and through Noah into the post-flood world? The answer the text implies is that the corruption was not in the knowledge itself, but in the manner of its transmission and the use to which it was put. The astronomical knowledge, the understanding of time's proper structure, the cosmological map of the world's edges and the chambers of the dead, these are not corrupted things. They are gifts of legitimate revelation, given to Enoch through proper channels, and they can survive the flood without bringing its corruption with them. This distinction between the legitimate and the illegitimate transmission of antediluvian knowledge is one of the Book of Enoch's most subtle and important contributions to the longer history of thinking about the pre-flood world. It refuses the easy either-or. The antediluvian world was not simply good knowledge destroyed by bad behaviour, nor was it simply evil knowledge properly eliminated. It was a world that contained both in an unstable mixture, and the flood separated them, destroying the corruption while allowing the legitimate revelation to pass through in written form in the text that Enoch committed to Methuselah's keeping. Noah himself appears in the Book of Enoch in a remarkable passage known to scholars as the Book of Noah, which seems to have been an originally separate document that was incorporated into the larger Enochic collection. This passage describes the circumstances of Noah's birth in terms that are startling even by the standards of ancient religious literature. When Noah is born, his father Lamech is terrified by the child's appearance. The newborn Noah has a body that is white as snow and red as a rose, hair that is white as wool, eyes that are like the sun, and when he opens those eyes they illuminate the entire house. Lamech goes to his own father Methuselah in fear, saying that he does not believe this child is truly his, that the child seems to be of the Watchers and not of a human father. This birth narrative sits uncomfortably alongside everything the Book of Enoch has said about the catastrophic results of the Watchers' unions with human women. Noah, the figure chosen to survive and restart humanity, appears at birth in terms that might describe one of the Nephilim. His physical description echoes the descriptions of heavenly beings in other parts of the text. Methuselah goes to Enoch to ask for clarity, and Enoch, in his heavenly exile, reassures him. This child is not of the Watchers. He's a child of Lamech, born different because he has been set apart for a special purpose, because the world is about to be destroyed, and this child will be the instrument of its continuation. But the question that Lamech asks and the terror that prompts it is not simply dismissed. The fact that a human child can be born so luminously strange that his own father wonders whether he might be of superhuman origin suggests something about the antediluvian world that the text does not quite say aloud. The boundaries in that world were permeable enough, the mixture of the divine and the human thorough enough, that even within the lineage of the righteous the possibility of such a question could arise. The world before the flood was genuinely different from the world after it, not just politically or socially, but in some deeper sense that affected the very appearance of the people born into it. This is another place where the Book of Enoch resonates with traditions from other cultures. The Sumerian king list, which catalogues the rulers of Mesopotamia, from the mythological dawn of kingship to historical times, describes the antediluvian kings as reigning for lengths of time that are orders of magnitude greater than anything possible in the historical period. Reigns of 20,000 years, of 36,000 years, are recorded with the same matter-of-fact notation as reigns of 30 or 40 years in the later historical period. The flood appears on the king list as a marker, a line after which everything changes. The reigns become shorter, the figures become more recognisably human in their lifespans and in their apparent nature. Something that was possible before the flood is not possible after it. The biblical genealogies show a similar pattern, though compressed into less extreme numbers. The antediluvian patriarchs in Genesis, the figures from Adam to Noah, live for hundreds and hundreds of years. After the flood, the lifespans decrease steadily, generation by generation, until by the time of the historical period they have settled into the range of ordinary human experience. The Book of Enoch's birth narrative of Noah, with its luminous infant and the terror it provokes, can be read as a trace of this transition, a moment when the antediluvian world and the post-flood world are briefly simultaneous in the body of a single newborn child. The question of why the antediluvian patriarchs are described as living so long has occupied biblical scholars and commentators for millennia. The explanations range from the literal, that human beings before the flood simply did live that long for physiological reasons connected to a different atmosphere or diet or divine favour, to the symbolic, that the numbers represent something other than individual lifespans, perhaps the duration of dynasties or the age of traditions. The ancient Jewish commentators were themselves divided on this question. Some took the numbers literally and devoted considerable ingenuity to explaining them physiologically. Others read them as indicators of a fundamentally different order of existence, not just a quantitative difference in lifespan, but a qualitative difference in the nature of life itself. The Book of Enoch does not engage this question directly, but its cosmology supports the qualitative reading. The antediluvian world in the Enochic telling was a world where the boundaries between different orders of being were thinner. Heaven was closer to earth. The divine was more directly accessible to the human. The angels who served as intermediaries between the two realms were more present, more physically real, more capable of genuine interaction with the human world, for better and for worse. This thinness of the veil between realms is what made the Watcher's transgression possible, and what made the luminous strangeness of Noah's birth imaginable. In a world where heaven and earth were in closer contact, the possibility of crossings and contaminations and wonders was correspondingly greater. The flood, in this reading, does something beyond simply killing the corrupted and preserving the righteous. It thickens the veil, it increases the distance between heaven and earth. The post-flood world is a world in which the divine is less immediately accessible, in which the angelic is less physically present, in which the channels of communication between the human and the transcendent are narrower and more indirect. This is why Enoch's own story matters so much in the text's larger logic. He is the last figure who crosses that boundary freely, who walks with God in the most literal sense that the text knows. After the flood, no one walks with God the way Enoch walked with God. The relationship is mediated differently, through prophecy and vision and text, through the very books that Enoch left behind precisely because the direct access he had would not be available to those who came after. This creates a poignant undertow in the Book of Enoch's narrative of the pre-flood world. For all its catastrophe, for all the violence and corruption the Watchers and their descendants brought, the antediluvian world was a world where certain kinds of direct experience were possible that are no longer possible. The flood preserved the righteous and destroyed the wicked, but it also changed the nature of the world itself in ways that were not entirely gain. Something was lost. Not the corruption, not the violence, not the monstrous appetites of the Nephilim, but something else, something harder to name, some quality of closeness between the human and the divine that the transgression of the Watchers paradoxically made possible even as it made it dangerous. The tradition of the fallen angels, which is what the Watchers are, has sometimes been misread as a story about beings who were simply evil, who desired transgression for its own sake, who were demonic in the conventional sense of that word from the very beginning. The Book of Enoch is more careful than that, and more interesting. The Watchers are not described as evil before their descent. They are described as Watchers, as beings of attention and awareness, as members of the heavenly assembly who functioned properly until the moment of their transgression. The desire they feel for the daughters of men is presented as a real desire, not a demonic simulation of it. They recognize its transgressive nature and proceed anyway. The tragedy of their story is not that they are monsters, but that they are something closer to the opposite, beings capable of genuine feeling who make a genuine and fully conscious choice to prioritize that feeling over the order they were created to maintain. This reading of the Watchers has significant implications for how we understand the civilization they helped create. If the Watchers were not simply evil, but were capable beings who made a catastrophic choice, then the knowledge they brought down with them was real knowledge. The metallurgy worked, the astronomy was accurate, the medicinal arts were genuinely effective. The texts that came out of the antediluvian world were not corrupted in their technical content. They were corrupted in their context, in the relationships of power and transgression within which they were transmitted and applied. The knowledge itself remained, waiting to be either used destructively, as the Nephilim used it, or recovered and used wisely, as the Enochic tradition hoped. This is not a subtle point. The civilization before the flood, in the Book of Enoch's cosmology, was a civilization with real and sophisticated knowledge. That knowledge was transmitted through illegitimate channels, but that did not make it false. The stars moved the way Enoch said they moved. The metals behaved the way Azazel taught. The roots and herbs had the medicinal properties the Watchers described. And when the flood came and the civilization was destroyed, that knowledge did not simply disappear. Some of it was preserved in Enoch's written records, passed through Methuselah to Noah. Some of it persisted in the unhoused spirits of the Nephilim, available to be accessed in distorted and dangerous forms. Some of it, the tradition suggests, was simply in the world, embedded in the properties of stones and stars and plants, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone patient and observant enough to look. The idea that the antediluvian civilization left traces in the fabric of the world itself, not just in texts and traditions but in the inherent properties of things, is one that will become enormously important as we follow the Book of Enoch's influence forward through centuries and into the esoteric traditions of late antiquity and the medieval world. But that is a story for a little later in our journey tonight. For now, the room is very still. The story has carried us through the cosmological landscape of the Book of Enoch, through Enoch's journeys to the edges of the world, through the birth of Noah and the questions it raises about the antediluvian world's strange proximity to the divine, through the tragedy of the Watchers and the complex moral texture of the knowledge they brought with them. These are not simple things, and they do not need to be held tightly. Let them rest in whatever part of the mind receives stories when the body is settling towards sleep. There is still more to come. The story of how the Book of Enoch was treated by the communities that came after its original authors, how it was embraced and condemned and preserved and hidden and finally found again, is a story as rich and strange as the text itself. And the question of what the antediluvian civilization might have actually been, what historical realities might lie beneath the mythological surface of the Enochic narrative, is a question that serious scholars and earnest seekers have been asking for a very long time, with more interesting results than is usually acknowledged. The fan keeps its steady sound. The lamp is low. Whatever darkness fills the spaces of the room where you are resting, it is a comfortable darkness, full of the quiet of the late hour. The story continues just ahead, and there is all the time in the world. The fan turns softly, the night is deep, the story continues just ahead. The Book of Enoch did not disappear quietly. When the great councils of Rabbinic Judaism in the centuries following the destruction of the Second Temple began the long process of defining which texts belonged to the sacred canon and which did not, the Book of Enoch was among those that did not make the final list. This was not a casual decision, and it was not made because the text was unknown or obscure. The rabbis who deliberated over these questions were learned men who had read widely in the literature of their tradition. They knew the Book of Enoch, they knew its stories and its cosmology and its claims, and they decided, for reasons that are partly recoverable and partly lost to us, that it should not be included among the authoritative texts that defined Jewish religious life going forward. The reasons that scholars have reconstructed for this exclusion are several, and none of them is simple. One concerns the text's treatment of angels. The Book of Enoch gives angels a degree of independence, a capacity for genuine agency and genuine transgression that rabbinic theology found uncomfortable. In the rabbinic framework that was consolidating in the centuries after the temple's destruction, angels tend to be more purely instrumental, more fully subordinate to divine will, less capable of the kind of autonomous desire and decision-making that the Watchers display. a text that placed angelic transgression at the centre of its cosmology, that made fallen angels responsible for the origins of evil and suffering, raised theological questions that the rabbinic tradition preferred to answer differently. Another reason concerns the text's calendar. The solar calendar defended in the Book of Enoch's astronomical book was associated with the Qumran community and with other groups that had separated themselves from the mainstream of Jewish religious practice. Using a different calendar was not a minor difference. It meant observing the Sabbath and the festivals on different days, which in the ancient world was a serious marker of communal identity and separation. A text that argued for the correctness of the non-mainstream calendar was, in this sense, a sectarian text, associated with communities that had positioned themselves in opposition to the traditions the rabbis were working to consolidate and preserve. A third reason, perhaps the most fundamental, concerns the text's mode of authority. The Book of Enoch claims its authority through direct heavenly revelation. Enoch ascends. Angels speak to him. He sees the structures of heaven and the ends of the earth. He writes down what he has been shown. The authority of what he writes rests entirely on the reality of his experience and the reliability of his heavenly informants. This is a mode of authority that the rabbinic tradition, which was building its legitimacy on the interpretation of Torah through the chain of tradition from Sinai, found difficult to accommodate. Revealed texts that claimed to report direct heavenly knowledge were a potential challenge to the authority structure that the rabbis were carefully constructing. One book of that kind could be managed. A whole genre of such books was another matter. And yet, the Book of Enoch survived. It survived precisely because the forces that pushed it out of one tradition found it welcomed in another. The early Christian communities, who were in the 1st and 2nd centuries still closely related to their Jewish origins but increasingly defining themselves as a separate movement, embraced the Book of Enoch with considerable enthusiasm. The letter of Jude in the New Testament quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, identifying it by reference to Enoch himself and treating its words as prophetic authority. Several of the early Christian writers known as the Church Fathers cite the Book of Enoch, discuss its theology, and engage with its account of the fallen angels. Tertullian, writing in North Africa at the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era, defended the text's authenticity at length and used its account of the Watchers to explain the origin of both pagan religion and cosmetic self-adornment, connecting the Watcher's teaching of ornamentation to the practices of women in his own time, with a directness that modern readers tend to find startling. The early Christian engagement with the Book of Enoch was not simply a matter of borrowing a convenient cosmological framework. The text's account of the Watchers and the Nephilim resonated with early Christian theology in specific and important ways. The idea that the world was under the influence of fallen spiritual beings, that the visible suffering and injustice of the world reflected an invisible cosmic conflict, that the current age was drawing toward a judgment that would overturn the power of these beings and restore the proper order of things, all of this fit naturally into the apocalyptic framework that early Christianity had largely inherited from its Jewish origins and was developing in its own distinctive ways. The figure of Enoch himself held particular fascination for early Christian thinkers because he was, like the figure at the centre of Christian faith, a human being who had been taken up to God without passing through ordinary death. The parallel was not exact. The theological claims made about the two figures were very different, but the structural similarity was impossible to ignore. Enoch, who did not die and was taken, Jesus, who died but rose and ascended, both were figures who enacted the possibility of a transition from the human to the divine that ordinary death and ordinary life did not provide. For communities meditating on what the resurrection and ascension meant and what they promised for believers, the figure of Enoch was a rich and suggestive predecessor. As the centuries passed and Christian theology became more systematized, the Book of Enoch's status became more contested. By the 4th century, the church councils that were defining the Christian canon with increasing precision were generally reluctant to include the Book of Enoch among the authoritative texts. The reasons overlapped with some of the rabbinic objections. The text's mode of authority, its complex and sometimes difficult cosmology, its potential for supporting readings of the relationship between angels and human beings that more conservative theologians found troubling. The specific concern about the literal interpretation of the Watcher's story, the idea that angels had physically descended and physically reproduced with human women, was one that several important Christian thinkers, including Augustine of Hippo, went to considerable lengths to resist, arguing for allegorical or non-literal readings of the relevant passages. Augustine's engagement with the Watchers tradition is itself a significant moment in the long history of the Book of Enoch's influence. In his enormous work, The City of God, written in the early 5th century in the aftermath of Rome's sack by the Visigoths, Augustine devotes careful attention to the Sons of God passage in Genesis and to the tradition surrounding it. He is aware of the interpretation that identifies the sons of God with angels who physically descended. He rejects it, not because he thinks the text is unimportant, but because he thinks the physical interpretation raises more theological problems than it solves. His preferred reading is that the sons of God were righteous descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam, who intermarried with the unrighteous descendants of Cain, and that the corruption that resulted was a moral and spiritual corruption rather than a cosmic one involving fallen angels. This Augustinian interpretation became enormously influential in Western Christianity. It effectively redirected the theological conversation away from the Enochic cosmology and toward a more straightforwardly moral reading of the pre-flood narrative. The flood was the consequence of widespread human sinfulness, specifically the sinfulness that resulted from the intermarriage of two lineages that should have remained separate. The angelic dimension of the story was set aside or relegated to a minority position for many centuries, but it did not disappear. It survived in popular tradition, in folklore, in the persistent fascination with the idea of beings that were neither fully human nor fully divine. It survived in the work of medieval commentators who continued to wrestle with the Genesis passage and the tradition surrounding it. And it survived, most significantly for our story, in the one Christian community that never set aside the Book of Enoch at all. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the Book of Enoch as part of its biblical canon throughout the centuries, when the text was largely inaccessible to European and Near Eastern Christianity. Ethiopia had received Christianity in the 4th century during the reign of King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire, and the Ethiopian Church developed its own distinctive theological and textual traditions, including a biblical canon that is larger than those of either the Western Catholic or Eastern Orthodox churches. The Book of Enoch, known in the Ethiopian tradition by the Ge'ez name Metzhafa Enoch, was among the texts that Ethiopian Christianity retained as authoritative scripture. It was copied and recopied in Ge'ez, the classical literary language of Ethiopia, over many centuries, and it was read, studied and preached from in Ethiopian churches without interruption. This is why, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from his travels in Ethiopia in 1773 and brought with him 3 manuscript copies of the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, it was the first time most European scholars had access to a complete text of this work in nearly 1,000 years. The excitement in European scholarly circles was considerable. The Scottish theologian and Orientalist Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation of the complete text in 1821, and from that point onward the Book of Enoch re-entered the intellectual life of the Western world with increasing force. The rediscovery of the Book of Enoch in the 19th century coincided with an extraordinary expansion of knowledge about the ancient Near East more broadly. Archaeologists and scholars were deciphering cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system of ancient Mesopotamia, for the first time. The texts they were recovering from the buried libraries of Assyria and Babylon were revealing a world of mythology and cosmology that had been completely unknown to Western scholarship. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its flood narrative, was translated and published in 1872, causing a sensation because of its obvious parallels to the biblical story. The tablets from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh were being read and understood, revealing an ancient literary culture of astonishing richness and sophistication. Into this context came the rediscovered Book of Enoch, and scholars quickly began to see connections that earlier readers could not have seen. The Apkallu traditions of Babylon, the antediluvian sages who taught humanity the arts of civilization, now appeared alongside the watchers of the Enochic text with obvious comparative significance. The long reigns of the Sumerian king list could be set beside the long lifespans of the biblical antediluvian patriarchs and the strangely altered nature of the pre-flood world that both traditions described. The flood narrative, appearing in multiple independent ancient traditions from different parts of the ancient world, began to look less like a local tradition and more like a memory, however mythologized, of something that had genuinely happened. This late 19th and early 20th century convergence of recovered texts, from the Book of Enoch to the Mesopotamian libraries to the Egyptian religious literature that was also being translated for the first time, created an intellectual environment in which very large questions about the origins of civilization seemed suddenly open. If all these ancient traditions shared certain structural features, if they all described a pre-flood world of different and somehow greater beings who transmitted knowledge to humanity, if they all placed a global catastrophe at the hinge point between that world and ours, was there something behind all of these traditions? Was there a historical reality, however distorted by millennia of mythological elaboration, that all of them were trying to describe? These are questions that serious mainstream scholarship approaches with considerable caution, and for good reasons. The methodology required to move from mythological parallels to historical claims is treacherous, full of the temptation to find what you are looking for, to read convergences as confirmations of a predetermined thesis. The history of archaeology and ancient history is full of examples of enthusiastic scholars and less scrupulous popularizers who assembled genuine evidence into false conclusions by allowing the pattern they wanted to find to shape the pattern they actually found. Mainstream scholarship is appropriately resistant to grand unified theories of ancient civilization precisely because the evidence is fragmentary, the methodologies are contested, and the temptation to overread is very great. And yet the questions themselves are not illegitimate. The structural parallels between the ancient traditions about the pre-flood world are real. Scholars who study the ancient Near East professionally take them seriously, even when they disagree vigorously about what those parallels mean. The existence of widespread ancient flood traditions, from Mesopotamia to Greece to South Asia to the Americas, is a well-documented phenomenon that requires explanation. The explanation does not have to be a literal global flood to be interesting. It could reflect regional catastrophic flooding events in the ancient past, of which there is geological evidence in several parts of the world. It could reflect the shared inheritance of very old narrative traditions that spread through human migration across the ancient world. It could reflect independent attempts by different cultures to grapple with the universal human experience of catastrophic natural events. All of these explanations are on the table, and the honest answer is probably some combination of them. The room where you are resting has been very patient with these long thoughts. The ideas have been moving at a good pace, covering territory that spans many centuries and many cultures, and it is worth allowing a moment of stillness now. The flood traditions of the ancient world, whatever their ultimate origin, represent one of humanity's most persistent attempts to make sense of catastrophic change, of the experience of a world ending and another beginning. That is a human experience that does not require a global catastrophe to be real. Every generation knows it in some form, every person knows it in some form, the world before and the world after, with something irreversible in between. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in 1947 added another major chapter to the modern scholarly engagement with the Book of Enoch. The scrolls, found in caves near Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, included Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch that turned out to be the oldest surviving manuscript evidence for the text, dating in some cases to the 2nd century before the Common Era. These fragments confirmed what scholars had suspected from the Ge'ez manuscripts, that the Book of Enoch was not a late composition but a genuinely ancient text, rooted in traditions that went back to the period of the Second Temple, and possibly earlier. The Aramaic fragments also revealed some interesting differences from the later Ge'ez manuscripts that had been the primary basis for 19th century scholarship. Some passages were shorter in the Aramaic, some details differed, suggesting a long history of transmission during which the text had been expanded, edited, and in some places altered. This is not surprising for a text of this antiquity, but it does mean that the Book of Enoch we have is not a single stable document, but a tradition, a conversation across centuries that took different shapes in different communities and different periods. The scholar George Nicholsburg, whose work on the Book of Enoch in the late 20th and early 21st centuries represents perhaps the most comprehensive modern engagement with the text from a mainstream scholarly perspective, argued for reading the Enochic tradition not as a single text, but as a movement, a sustained intellectual and religious project carried on by specific communities over several centuries. These communities, which Nicholsburg called the Enochic communities, used the figure of Enoch and the tradition of his heavenly revelations as a framework for developing their distinctive theological and social vision. They were communities with a specific identity, a specific set of concerns, and a specific way of reading the world that the Book of Enoch both expressed and reinforced. understanding the Book of Enoch as the product of a community, rather than of a single author or a single moment, changes how we read it. It means that the apparent inconsistencies and repetitions in the text are not simply errors or careless editing, but traces of a living tradition that was constantly being renewed and adapted. The different sections of the text, the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dreams, the Epistle of Enoch, and the remarkable section known as the Similitudes or Parables of Enoch, each reflects a somewhat different moment and a somewhat different set of concerns within the broader Enochic movement. They share a cosmological framework and a commitment to the figure of Enoch as the paradigmatic recipient of heavenly revelation, but they develop that framework in different directions and with different emphasis. The similitudes of Enoch deserve particular attention in the context of the pre-flood civilization because they introduce a figure that does not appear in the other sections of the book, a figure known as the Son of Man. This heavenly figure, described as having been with God before the creation of the world, is revealed to Enoch in his highest vision as the one who will judge the world at the end of days, who will overthrow the kings and the powerful and establish the kingdom of the righteous. The Son of Man of the similitudes is not the Watcher's offspring. He is not connected to the pre-flood transgression. He is its opposite, the righteous heavenly figure who will finally and definitively undo the damage that the Watcher's descent set in motion. The relationship between the Son of Man in the Similitudes of Enoch and the Son of Man in the New Testament Gospels has been one of the most intensely debated questions in modern New Testament scholarship. The similitudes were not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has led some scholars to date them later than the other sections of the Book of Enoch, possibly to the late 1st century of the Common Era, which would make them roughly contemporary with the Gospel literature rather than prior to it. Others argue for an earlier date. The debate is not resolved. But the existence of this heavenly Son of Man figure in the Enochic tradition, standing in cosmic opposition to the fallen Watchers and the civilization they corrupted, is one of the clearest examples of how the Book of Enoch's pre-flood narrative is not simply about the past. It is oriented toward the future, toward a resolution, toward the moment when the consequences of the antediluvian transgression are finally brought to their end. This eschatological orientation, this insistence that the story of the Watchers and the civilization they helped create is not finished, but is moving toward a resolution, is what gives the Book of Enoch its peculiar emotional texture. It is not a text of despair, even though it describes things that are genuinely terrible. It is a text of a very long patience. The Watchers are bound, but the judgment that was pronounced on them is not yet fully executed. The spirits of the Nephilim are loose in the world, but they will not be loose forever. The righteous who cry out from the chambers of the dead are heard, and their cries will be answered. The pre-flood civilization left a wound in the fabric of the world, but wounds can heal, and the text insists that this one will. That insistence is part of what made the Book of Enoch so valuable to the communities that preserved it through centuries when it was officially marginal or excluded. Communities that are suffering need more than an explanation of why they are suffering. They need a reason to believe that the suffering is not the final word. The Book of Enoch provides exactly that, rooted in a cosmology that goes all the way back to before the flood, that shows the present suffering as part of a pattern that began long before and will end in a resolution that the pattern itself makes inevitable. The night has deepened around the place where you are resting. Whatever softness is in the air, whatever comfortable weight surrounds you, it is the same night that has surrounded everyone who has ever listened to a long story in the dark, waiting for the resolution that the storyteller promises is coming. The story of the Book of Enoch is very old, and it is very patient, and it knows that some resolutions take longer than a single night. But it offers, in the meantime, the peculiar comfort of a very large perspective, the sense that the confusions and violences and losses of any particular moment are held within a framework that is larger than they are, and that the framework has a direction. The lamp is low, the fan keeps it steady turning. There is more to come, and all of it waits quietly in the dark ahead. The fan turns softly. The night is deep. The story continues just ahead. There is a version of the Book of Enoch's story about the civilization before the flood that has circulated in popular culture for several decades now, and it is worth spending some time with it tonight, not to dismiss it, but to understand what it gets right and what it gets wrong, and what the gap between those two things reveals about how ancient texts get read in the modern world. The version I am describing is the one that says the Nephilim were extraterrestrials. that the Watchers were beings from another world or another dimension who arrived on Earth in some form of craft, who possessed technological knowledge so advanced that it appeared supernatural to the humans who encountered it, and who interacted with human women in ways that produced hybrid offspring. In this reading, the flood is not a divine judgment, but a catastrophic event, perhaps cosmic in origin, that destroyed a genuinely advanced antediluvian civilization whose remains we have not yet correctly identified. The pyramids, the megalithic structures at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the precisely fitted stonework of ancient Andean sites, all of these become evidence of the technological inheritance of the pre-flood civilization, traces of a knowledge so sophisticated that ordinary ancient humans could not have produced it unaided. This reading has reached an enormous popular audience through books, documentaries, and in recent years through streaming series and podcast conversations that present it with varying degrees of care. Its most influential modern proponents have included figures like Zecharia Sitchin, whose series of books beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976 argued for a highly specific reading of Sumerian mythology as literal accounts of extraterrestrial visitors, and more recently writers and researchers like Graham Hancock, whose work focuses less on extraterrestrials and more on the possibility of a lost advanced civilization destroyed by a global catastrophe at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. These are very different claims, and they deserve to be treated differently. Sitchin's work has been examined carefully by scholars of Sumerian language and literature, and the consensus among those scholars is that his translations and interpretations of the cuneiform texts are not linguistically defensible. The specific readings he gives to Sumerian words and phrases, readings that support his extraterrestrial thesis, do not hold up against the standards of the field. This is not a matter of mainstream scholars protecting a comfortable consensus from an uncomfortable outsider. It is a matter of whether the linguistic evidence supports the claims being made, and in Sitchin's case the scholarly judgment is that it does not. The Anunnaki, the Sumerian gods whose name Sitchin interpreted as meaning those who from heaven to earth came, are, in mainstream Sumerian scholarship, simply the great gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, whose name has a more mundane etymology, and whose nature in the texts is that of divine beings in the conventional ancient Near Eastern sense. Graham Hancock's work is a more interesting case, because it operates on somewhat different grounds. Hancock does not rely primarily on linguistic arguments about ancient texts. He focuses more on the physical evidence of ancient sites, on astronomical alignments, on the geological record of the end of the last ice age, and on the structural similarities between ancient traditions from different parts of the world. His core claim, that there was a sophisticated civilization in the ancient world that was largely destroyed by catastrophic events around 12,000 years ago, and that the surviving traditions of many cultures preserve memories of that civilization, is not provably true, but it is not as easily dismissed as Sitchin's linguistic claims. It is a hypothesis about history, and like any historical hypothesis, it needs to be evaluated against the evidence. The mainstream archaeological and geological response to this hypothesis has generally been skeptical, for reasons that are worth understanding carefully. The primary objection is not that catastrophic events did not occur at the end of the last ice age. They did. The Younger Dryas period, which began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted about 12 centuries, was characterized by rapid and severe climate change, the advance and retreat of glaciers, rising sea levels as ice sheets melted, and almost certainly significant disruption to human populations around the world. There is also genuine scientific debate about whether a cosmic impact event, possibly a comet or asteroid breaking up in the atmosphere, may have contributed to or triggered some of these changes. This is not fringe science. It is an active area of research with papers being published in mainstream peer-reviewed journals. The objection is rather to the specific claim about a sophisticated pre-existing civilization. The archaeological record does not support the existence of a civilization with the kind of technological and social complexity that the hypothesis requires in the time period before the Younger Dryas. What the record shows for that period is sophisticated hunter-gatherer cultures, some of which were producing genuinely remarkable things. Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, the site of massive stone enclosures with elaborately carved pillars that date to approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, is real, and it is genuinely astonishing. It demonstrates that human beings at the end of the last ice age were capable of organized, large-scale, symbolically sophisticated construction projects that required social coordination well beyond what had previously been assumed for that period. It is a genuine discovery that has changed the way archaeologists think about the cognitive and social capacities of late Paleolithic and early Neolithic humans. But Göbekli Tepe does not require a lost civilization to explain it. What it requires is a willingness to take seriously the complexity and capability of ancient hunter-gatherer societies, to revise downward the assumption that sophisticated symbolic and architectural achievement required the full package of agriculture, settled cities, writing, and metallurgy that we associate with the later ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were extraordinary. They were not, on the current evidence, the remnants of an even more extraordinary civilization that came before them. This distinction matters for how we read the Book of Enoch's account of the pre-flood world, because the popular alternative history reading tends to collapse the Enochic narrative into a specific archaeological hypothesis in ways that do not serve either the text or the archaeology well. The Book of Enoch is not a geological or archaeological document. It is a theological and cosmological one. Its account of the pre-flood civilization is not primarily a claim about physical remains or technological artifacts. It is a claim about the origin and nature of knowledge, about the relationship between the human and the divine, about why evil exists and where it comes from, and what is going to happen to it. Reading the Nephilim as ancient astronauts, or reading the antediluvian civilization as a technologically advanced society, whose ruins we should be looking for under the ocean, is to translate the text out of the register in which it operates and into a register that it never claimed to occupy. That said, and this is the part that tends to get lost in the polemics on both sides, the Book of Enoch's account of the pre-flood world does contain something that connects, however obliquely, to genuine historical questions about the origins of civilization. The question of where and how the foundational knowledge systems of the first great civilizations arose is not a settled question. The transition from the mobile hunter-gatherer cultures of the late Paleolithic to the settled agricultural civilizations of the Neolithic and Bronze Age was extraordinarily rapid by the standards of the timescales involved, and the mechanisms of that transition are still being actively studied and debated. The appearance of writing, of systematic agriculture, of urban planning, of astronomical record-keeping, of complex religious and legal institutions, all within a relatively short window of several thousand years in the ancient Near East and independently in several other parts of the world, is something that historians and archaeologists find genuinely interesting and genuinely complex. The Book of Enoch's answer to this question, that the foundational knowledge of civilization was transmitted from outside the purely human realm, is of course not a scholarly hypothesis about migration and cultural diffusion, but the underlying question it is answering, where did all of this come from so quickly, is a real question. The ancient authors who composed the Enochic tradition were responding to the same puzzle that modern scholars respond to, the puzzle of the apparent discontinuity between the simple and the complex, between the pre-civilizational and the civilizational. Their answer was theological and mythological. Modern scholarship's answers are archaeological and anthropological, but the question is shared. There is also a serious scholarly conversation about the Book of Enoch and the origins of esoteric and occult tradition that deserves careful attention tonight, because it represents one of the most significant ways in which the antediluvian civilization of the Enochic text has shaped the actual history of ideas in the Western world. The connection runs through the Hermetic tradition, which we touched on earlier, and through the broader phenomenon of Jewish mysticism, and through the specifically Enochic strand of magical and divinatory practice that scholars have traced through late antiquity and into the medieval period. The Hermetic texts, those writings attributed to the semi-mythological Hermes Trismegistus, and composed primarily in Greek and Egypt during the first few centuries of the Common Era, share with the Book of Enoch a fundamental orientation toward the cosmos as a meaningful and structured whole, accessible to human understanding through the proper application of revealed knowledge. The Hermetic tradition is deeply interested in astrology, in the properties of stones and plants and metals, in the relationship between celestial and terrestrial phenomena, in the possibility of ascending through the spheres of the cosmos to access higher knowledge. All of these interests have obvious parallels in the Book of Enoch's astronomical sections, and in the curriculum of knowledge that the Watchers brought with them. Scholars have debated whether the Hermetic tradition directly drew on the Enochic tradition, or whether both drew independently on a common fund of ancient Near Eastern ideas. The answer is probably some of both. The intellectual world of Hellenistic Egypt, where the Hermetic texts were composed, was a world of extraordinary cultural mixture, where Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, Babylonian and Persian ideas circulated and combined in ways that are often impossible to disentangle. The Book of Enoch was almost certainly known in some form in this environment, given the Jewish communities of Alexandria and the broader Hellenistic world. And the specific ideas that connect the two traditions, the transmitted antediluvian knowledge, the angel-like intermediary figures, the ascending visionary, the revealed cosmological map, were clearly part of the shared intellectual atmosphere. The trajectory from the Hermetic tradition runs forward into the Renaissance, when the recovery and translation of the Hermetic texts by Marsilio Ficino in Florence in the 1460s had an enormous impact on European intellectual culture. Ficino and his circle, including the extraordinary figure of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, saw in the Hermetic writings a confirmation of the idea that there existed a primordial wisdom, a prisca theologia, or ancient theology, that had been known before the corruptions of history and that could be recovered by the properly initiated scholar. This primordial wisdom was imagined as going back beyond Greece and Egypt to the very beginning of human intellectual history, to the figures who stood closest to the moment of original revelation. Enoch inevitably was one of those figures. The Renaissance engagement with the Enochic tradition was not simply scholarly, it was practical. The same period that saw Ficino translating the Hermetic corpus also saw an explosion of interest in Kabbalah, the tradition of Jewish mystical interpretation, much of which draws on cosmological ideas that have clear connections to the Book of Enoch's heavenly geography. The Christian Kabbalists of the Renaissance, Pico della Mirandola prominent among them, attempted to synthesize Kabbalah with Hermeticism and with Christian theology in ways that placed the figure of Enoch at the intersection of all three traditions. Enoch who walked with God, Enoch who was taken up, Enoch who received the revealed knowledge of the cosmos and transmitted it forward through the catastrophe of the flood, was the figure who stood at the origin of the entire project of recovered wisdom. This Renaissance synthesis had consequences that ran forward into the 17th century and into the origins of what we would now call the esoteric tradition in Western culture. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, mysterious documents that appeared in Germany claiming to announce the existence of a secret brotherhood devoted to the reform of knowledge and the healing of the world, drew on this same complex of ideas. The fictional or semi-fictional founder of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, Christian Rosenkreuz, was a figure whose story followed the structural template of the ancient sage who travels to the east, receives hidden wisdom, and returns to transmit it to a small group of initiates who will preserve it until the world is ready for it. The template is Enoch's template, adapted for a new era. The Freemasonic tradition, which developed in England in the early 18th century and spread rapidly through European and American elite culture, included in its mythological framework a story about the antediluvian world that draws directly on the Enochic tradition. One of the Masonic legends tells of the patriarch Enoch, who foresaw the coming flood and constructed underground vaults in which he preserved the essential knowledge of the antediluvian world, inscribed on pillars of stone and brass that would survive the catastrophe. This legend of Enoch's pillars is a direct elaboration of the theme we have been following all night: the preservation of pre-flood knowledge through the flood, the survival of antediluvian wisdom in the post-flood world. In the Masonic version, the preserved knowledge is specifically associated with the arts and sciences of civilization, with geometry and architecture, and the mathematical principles that underlie the builder's craft. The Masons position themselves as the inheritors of this tradition, as the keepers of a wisdom that went back before the flood. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because the longevity of this theme is remarkable. From the Book of Enoch in the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era, through the Hermetic tradition of late antiquity, through the Renaissance recovery of Prisca Theologia, through the Rosicrucian manifestos, through Freemasonic mythology, all the way to the popular alternative history books of the late 20th century, the same basic story keeps returning. There is knowledge from before the flood. It was preserved through the catastrophe. It has been transmitted secretly or openly through a chain of initiated keepers, and it is available to be recovered if you know where to look and how to read the signs. This persistence is itself historically significant. It does not prove the literal truth of the story it tells, but it does tell us something about a persistent human need. The need to believe that the most important knowledge is not simply constructed by ordinary historical processes, that it has a source deeper than the merely human, that there is a tradition of understanding that goes back to the very beginning of the world as we know it, and that has not been entirely lost. That need, and the stories it generates, is part of the historical record regardless of whether the antediluvian civilization those stories describe was real in the way their tellers believed. The scholarly debate about the Book of Enoch's account of the pre-flood world is not then simply a debate about ancient mythology. It opens out onto very large questions about how human beings construct and transmit knowledge, about what counts as evidence and what counts as interpretation, about the relationship between mythological memory and historical reality. These are questions that honest scholars hold with appropriate humility, because the evidence is always partial, and the methodologies are always contestable, and the temptation to find what you are looking for is always present. What mainstream scholarship has established with reasonable confidence is this: the Book of Enoch is a genuinely ancient text, with roots in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and possibly earlier. It represents a serious and sophisticated theological engagement with questions about the origin of evil, the nature of the cosmos, and the relationship between the human and the divine. Its account of the pre-flood civilization is not literal history, but it is not simply fantasy either. It draws on real intellectual traditions, real astronomical knowledge, real debates about the origins of the arts of civilization, and it engages those traditions with a moral seriousness and a cosmological ambition that deserve respect. The communities that produced it were not credulous primitives telling campfire stories. They were learned people wrestling with the hardest questions their world posed to them, and they produced a text that has continued to be worth wrestling with for more than 2,000 years. What the alternative history tradition has contributed, at its best, is a reminder that the standard narratives of how civilization arose are not the only possible reading of the evidence. The mainstream account of human prehistory has been revised significantly in recent decades, and the revisions have consistently moved in the direction of recognizing greater complexity, greater capability, and greater antiquity for early human social and cognitive achievement than previous generations assumed. Göbekli Tepe, as we noted, is one example of this. The evidence for sophisticated astronomical knowledge in prehistoric cultures, evidence that continues to accumulate from sites around the world, is another. The willingness of the alternative tradition to take seriously the possibility that something important happened in the ancient world that has not yet been fully explained is not itself wrong, even when the specific explanations offered go beyond what the evidence supports. Where the alternative tradition consistently goes wrong is in the move from genuine puzzles to specific answers that are not proportionate to the evidence, in the willingness to treat mythological texts as literal historical documents without the methodological safeguards that make such readings defensible, and in the tendency to flatten the genuine sophistication of ancient peoples by treating their remarkable achievements as products of outside intervention rather than of their own extraordinary capacities. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not need extraterrestrial help. The people who composed the Book of Enoch did not need a literal antediluvian civilization to have inspired their cosmology. They were remarkable in their own right, operating within their own intellectual traditions, asking their own questions about the world they inhabited. The room is very quiet now. The hour is one of those hours when the night feels fully established, when the boundary between wakefulness and sleep becomes genuinely permeable, when ideas can pass through, without requiring the full attention of a mind on guard. That is a good state in which to receive what the Book of Enoch has been offering all night, not as a set of historical claims to be verified or rejected, but as a way of thinking about deep questions, about origins and knowledge and transgression and loss and the possibility of recovery. Those questions are as alive as they have ever been. They do not require ancient astronauts or lost continents to be worth asking. They require only the willingness to sit with them in the dark and listen. The fan turns softly. The night is deep. The story continues just ahead. We have been travelling for a long time tonight through a very old story, and it is worth arriving here at the last part of the journey with a sense of what we have actually been moving through. Not a summary, not a recitation of what was said, but something more like the feeling you get when you stand at the end of a long walk and turn to look back at the distance you have covered, the landscape visible now in a way it could not have been while you were moving through it. The Book of Enoch is that kind of text. It rewards the long view. It opens up differently when you have spent time with it than when you first encounter its strange and insistent visions. What the Book of Enoch hid about the civilization before the flood is, in the end, not a single secret. It is a layered argument, a sustained meditation on questions that do not resolve cleanly, carried out across multiple centuries by communities of thinkers who cared deeply about what their answers meant for how they lived and what they hoped for. The hiding was not deliberate concealment in the sense of a conspiracy. It was the ordinary hiding that happens when a text becomes marginal, when the communities that preserved it are themselves marginalized, when 1,000 years pass and a language is no longer widely read, and the manuscripts sit in monastery libraries in a country that most of the scholarly world could not easily reach. The Ethiopian monks who copied and recopied the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez across those centuries were not hiding anything. They were preserving something, faithfully and carefully, until the world was ready to receive it again. And the world, when it received the text back in the 18th and 19th centuries, was not entirely ready. The initial excitement of European scholars at recovering a complete text was real, but the fuller understanding of what the text contained and what it represented has been a much slower process, one that is still ongoing. The 20th century discoveries at Qumran, the careful philological work on the Aramaic fragments, the broader scholarly engagement with Second Temple Judaism as a period of extraordinary religious and intellectual creativity, rather than simply a transition between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, all of these have contributed to a richer and more honest picture of what the Book of Enoch is and why it matters. What it is, at its most fundamental, is a document of a community's attempt to make sense of the world's suffering. The communities that composed and preserved the Enochic tradition were communities that knew suffering from the inside, that lived under political and cultural pressures that were real and often brutal, that looked at the world around them and found it to be a place of injustice that the ordinary mechanisms of history seemed incapable of addressing. Their response was not despair, and it was not simple resignation. It was a reaching backward, a diving into the deepest available past, an attempt to find in the very structure of the cosmos an explanation for why the world was the way it was, and a guarantee that it would not always be so. The civilization before the flood, in the Book of Enoch's telling, is the origin point of that explanation. The Watchers descended, they taught, they transgressed. The world they helped create was destroyed, but not completely. The spirits of the Nephilim persisted. The corruption they represented persisted. And the world that came after the flood, the world that the Enochic communities inhabited, was a world still living in the long aftermath of that antediluvian catastrophe, still contending with forces that had their roots in a transgression so ancient that no living memory reached back to it. Only the text reached back, only the written word that Enoch had committed to Methuselah's keeping, and that had survived through the flood in Noah's keeping, and that had been transmitted, imperfectly and partially but recognizably, down through all the generations since. This is why the text is worth taking seriously as more than mythology and more than alternative history. It is a document of how a community understood its own position in a very large story, and that understanding shaped real choices and real lives. The people who read the Book of Enoch at Qumran and organize their lives around its calendar and its cosmology were not escapists or fantasists. They were people who had thought carefully about the nature of the world and had arrived at conclusions that required them to live differently, to maintain separations that the surrounding culture was constantly pressuring them to abandon, to insist on a vision of time and cosmic order that the official religious establishment of their day rejected. The Book of Enoch gave them the framework for that insistence. It told them that what they were resisting had roots going back before the flood, that the mixing and the corruption and the dissolution of proper boundaries were not simply the problems of their own historical moment, but were the oldest problems in the world, and that the resistance to them was correspondingly ancient and honourable. That is a remarkable thing for a text to do, and it is perhaps the most important thing the Book of Enoch hid about the civilization before the flood. Not a secret technology, not a race of giants whose bones are buried somewhere waiting to be found, not a cosmic conspiracy of extraterrestrial visitors, but a diagnosis, a precise and sustained diagnosis of what it looks like when knowledge is separated from wisdom, when power is exercised without restraint, when the boundaries that make ordered life possible are dissolved in the name of desire or convenience, or the will to dominate. The antediluvian civilization in the Book of Enoch is a civilization that had everything it needed to flourish and used what it had to destroy itself and everything around it. The Watchers brought real knowledge and real power, and in the absence of the proper framework for understanding what knowledge and power are for, that knowledge and power became catastrophic. The flood in this reading is not simply a punishment, it is a reset, a cosmic acknowledgement that the experiment had failed, that the mixture of the divine and the human in the form it had taken in the antediluvian world was not sustainable, that something fundamental had to change before a new beginning was possible, and the new beginning that comes after the flood is genuinely new, but it carries within it the memory of what came before, in the texts Enoch wrote, and in the spirits the flood could not touch, and in the deep structure of a world that is still, according to the Enochic cosmology, working through the consequences of that ancient transgression. There is something in this that speaks very directly to questions that are not ancient at all. The question of what knowledge is for, of whether the possession of sophisticated technical understanding carries with it any obligation about how that understanding is used, of what happens to a civilization that develops extraordinary capacities in the absence of the wisdom to guide them, is not a question that belongs only to the ancient world. It is a question that the modern world has been living inside for several centuries with accelerating intensity. The Book of Enoch does not offer a policy prescription or a political program. It offers something different and in some ways more valuable, a mythological framework that names the problem with a clarity that purely technical analysis often misses. The problem is not the knowledge. The problem is the transgression, the manner of the knowledge's arrival, the purposes it serves, the framework of understanding within which it is held or not held. The antediluvian world of the Book of Enoch had metallurgy, and it had war, it had astronomy, and it had the corruption of natural cycles for purposes of domination. It had medicinal knowledge, and it had the misuse of that knowledge in ways the text does not spell out in detail, but implies in its catalogue of the Watcher's transgressive teachings. Knowledge and its misuse arrived together, because the transmission was itself transgressive. The lesson the Enochic tradition draws from this is not that knowledge is bad or that the proper human posture is ignorance. Enoch himself is the argument against that reading. He receives knowledge, real and detailed and cosmologically significant knowledge, and he does something right with it. He writes it down. He transmits it through the proper channels. He situates it within a framework of purpose and obligation. The knowledge he preserves is the same kind of knowledge the Watchers brought down, astronomical, cosmological, concerned with the structure of the world and the proper ordering of time, but it is held differently, carried differently, used differently. This distinction, between knowledge held within a framework of obligation and knowledge wielded without such a framework, is one that the Enochic tradition returns to again and again without ever reducing it to a simple formula. It is a distinction that requires wisdom to apply in any specific case, and wisdom is precisely what the antediluvian world, for all its sophistication, could not produce in sufficient quantity. The Watchers were intelligent. The Nephilim were powerful. Neither intelligence nor power is the same as wisdom, and the Book of Enoch knows this with a precision that should give modern readers pause. The long tradition of the Book of Enoch's influence, which we trace through the Ethiopian Church and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Hermetic tradition, and the Renaissance and the esoteric movements of the early modern period, is itself a kind of demonstration of the text's central concern. Every generation that encountered the Enochic tradition had to decide what to do with it, how to hold the knowledge it contained, what framework to place around it, what purpose to assign to its preservation. Some communities held it well and some held it poorly, and some mixed the two in proportions that are still being assessed. But the text survived, and its central question survived with it, and those questions are available to anyone willing to sit quietly with a very old story and listen to what it is actually saying. The story it is actually saying, beneath all the angels and giants and heavenly journeys and forbidden knowledge and cosmic judgments, is something like this. The world is the way it is for reasons that go very deep. The violence and the corruption and the persistent difficulty of wisdom are not accidents or simply the products of individual bad choices. They have a history, a long and specific history that the text traces back to a moment before memory, before writing, before the flood that reset the conditions of the world. Understanding that history does not make the present easier, but it makes it less mysterious, and something in us, the part that stays awake late at night with questions that will not resolve, finds a strange comfort in that. The comfort is not in the answers. The Book of Enoch does not ultimately answer the questions it raises. It does not explain why the Watcher's desire was allowed to arise if it was always going to end in catastrophe. It does not explain why the spirits of the Nephilim were left loose in the world rather than being bound with their fathers. It does not explain what the final resolution that it promises will actually look like or feel like or mean for the ordinary lives of ordinary people waiting for it. The text gestures toward these things without fully illuminating them, as ancient visionary literature always does, because the things being gestured toward are genuinely beyond full illumination. But there is another kind of comfort available in the text that is not about answers at all. It is the comfort of scale. The Book of Enoch places human experience within a framework so large that the individual difficulties of any particular moment, any particular life, any particular historical period become legible as part of something that began before the flood and will continue until a final judgment that is still to come. That scale does not diminish individual experience. It does not make suffering less real or joy less precious. But it does provide a kind of perspective that is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. The things that feel overwhelming in the close foreground look different from a very great distance. Not smaller exactly, but differently shaped. Part of a pattern rather than simply chaotic, held within something rather than simply happening in a void. That sense of being held within something is what the communities that preserved the Book of Enoch were reaching for. It is what the Ethiopian monks who copied the Ge'ez manuscripts were reaching for. It is what the scholars at Qumran who treasured multiple copies of the Enochic texts were reaching for. And it is perhaps what anyone who spends a long quiet night with a very old story is reaching for, in whatever form and with whatever expectations they bring to the listening. The room where you are resting is very still now. The night has reached the part of itself that is deepest and most patient, the hours when the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes fluid and permeable, and the mind begins to move in ways that are neither fully one nor fully the other. The story has done what long stories do at this hour. It has settled into the background of awareness, not absent but no longer requiring active following. The images are there, the Watchers descending to the mountain, the luminous newborn Noah in his father's terrified arms, Enoch sitting by the waters of Dan reading aloud, a petition that will not be answered the way the petitioners hoped, the Ethiopian monastery where a monk bent over a manuscript in the lamplight and copied out the long visionary chapters with careful hands. These images do not demand anything, they simply remain. The fan, if you have one running, is doing its steady work. The soft sound it makes is the sound of the present moment, this specific night, this specific room, this particular person resting in the dark with an old story slowly settling through them like sediment through still water. You do not need to hold anything tightly. The questions the Book of Enoch asks are patient questions. They have waited thousands of years. They will wait until morning, until the next time you find yourself in a quiet place with time enough to think slowly. They are not urgent in the way that the demands of the day are urgent. They are the other kind, the kind that are always there, that persist beneath the surface of the busy hours, that surface naturally in the deep night when the busy hours finally release their hold. The world before the flood is very far away. And yet, the Book of Enoch insists quietly and persistently across all its strange and beautiful chapters that it is not as far away as it seems. The questions it generated are still being asked. The knowledge it contained is still being sought. The longing for a connection between the human and the divine that is real and direct and not mediated by all the complications that history has introduced. That longing is as alive tonight as it was in the 3rd century before the Common Era when the first Enochic communities were writing down their visions in the lamplit rooms of the ancient Near East. Let the breath slow a little. There's nothing that needs doing right now. The night is holding everything in its usual way, the stars moving in their long arcs above whatever clouds or light pollution or open sky is above the place where you are. The world turning slowly on its axis, as it has turned for longer than any text or tradition can reach. Enoch saw those stars from a place closer to them than any ordinary human being has access to. He counted their gates and their seasons and brought the count back down to earth and wrote it in a book that survived the flood and survived centuries of marginalization and survived the long journey from one culture to another and arrived, finally, in the libraries and the studies and the quiet reading hours of people who were willing to sit with it long enough to hear what it was saying. You have been one of those people tonight. The story is grateful for the company. The ancient questions are grateful for the attention, and the night for its part is doing what it always does, offering the particular mercy of its darkness and its quiet to everyone willing to accept it. The Book of Enoch will still be there in the morning, patient as it has always been. The questions will still be there, and you will be there too, rested and ready to carry them forward in whatever way is yours to carry them. For now, though, there is only this: the breath, the dark, the fan turning, the room holding you gently in the late hour, the stars above doing their ancient work, and the deep, comfortable weight of a night that has given you something worth thinking about slowly, over many days, in whatever quiet moments the world allows. Let the eyes stay closed. Let the thoughts drift without direction. There is nothing to arrive at and nowhere to be, and no question that requires an answer tonight. The civilization before the flood has waited this long. It can wait a little longer. Sleep well. Thank you for being here with us at Vestigia. Wherever tonight finds you, rest easy. The journey continues.